The night Rebecca Hale knocked on the door of Hollow Creek Ranch, she carried nothing but a damp canvas bag, a pair of torn boots, and one trembling sentence: "Please let me stay." The whole town believed Eleanor Brooke had made a foolish mistake the moment she let that widow cross the threshold, because a lonely old woman and a penniless widow, people said, could never hold an empty barn together through a Wyoming winter. Warren Pike laughed the loudest of all, certain that Hollow Creek was already as good as his, a carcass waiting only for the paperwork to catch up with the truth. But Rebecca did not walk onto that ranch with empty hands, whatever the town believed. She carried the memory of old cattle drives, the discipline of harder winters, survived long before this one, and a secret buried somewhere in the land itself, a secret that was about to wake a dying ranch from the inside out, one small, stubborn act at a time. If kindness sounds like weakness to you, listen until the night Hollow Creek lit up brighter than any ranch in the whole valley. It happened in Hollow Creek Valley, in Wyoming Territory, in the final years of the 1880s, when late autumn rain fell mixed with a thin, biting snow that never quite committed to winter and never quite let go of it either. The dirt road running through town had turned to black mud under weeks of steady rain, and the wind moved through the fences with a sound like a snapped fiddle string, thin and final, the kind of sound that made dogs stop barking and horses turn their backs to the gate. Rebecca Hale walked that road alone in the dark, her husband barely 2 weeks in the ground. Nolan Hale had died crossing a swollen creek while driving cattle for another man's herd, swept from his saddle in an instant that no one had thought to warn him about, and the rancher who had employed him handed his widow a few coins, muttered something about hard luck, and told her plainly that the bunkhouse had no room for a woman with no working hands to offer the outfit. She tried the general store first, hoping to buy bread, matches, and an old blanket on credit, standing at the counter with her coins counted twice already in her coat pocket. Cole Brantley refused her outright, saying flatly that he could not extend credit to a woman with nothing to put against it, not land, not livestock, not even a husband's name still worth something in the ledgers. Dean Mercer stood nearby, warming his hands at the stove, and laughed at the sight of her, telling her a widow without land ought to head back east before the western winter swallowed her whole the way it had swallowed better men than her husband. There was nowhere left to try after that, no door in town that had not already closed against her. So Rebecca turned instead toward the edge of the valley, toward the one place folks called the Dead Ranch, where an old woman named Eleanor Brooke lived alone behind a sagging fence and a barn that had not held cattle in longer than anyone in town could clearly remember. When Eleanor opened her door that night, lamp raised against the dark, and the rain still dripping from the eaves behind her, Rebecca said only 4 words: "Please let me stay." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, long enough to see past the wet hair plastered to her forehead and the trembling in her shoulders, long enough to notice a pair of eyes that still knew how to watch, to measure, to think clearly, even half frozen on a stranger's porch. Eleanor's own stores were thin that season, and Warren Pike was already circling her land like a man waiting patiently for a carcass to go still. Yet she stepped back from the door anyway and let the stranger in, because some decisions get made before a person has time to talk themselves out of them, and this was one of those. By morning, Rebecca saw the truth of Hollow Creek Ranch laid bare in daylight, and the truth was worse than any rumor the town had passed around it. The cattle pens stood entirely empty, swept clean by wind and years of neglect. The fences leaned at angles that promised to fall flat with the next hard gust, and the water trough had cracked clean through one long, dry summer ago, while the barn door banged loose on a single hinge every time the wind gusted past it. What hay remained in the loft would not carry two animals through even a mild season, let alone the hard one already gathering itself over the ridge, and the house itself, though swept and orderly and smelling faintly of lye soap, held the particular cold of a place kept alive by memory, rather than by any real warmth still burning inside its walls. Eleanor had once run a good outfit here, back when her husband Arthur Brooke was alive to read the land and the water, the way other men read scripture, patient and exact, and never wrong twice about the same stretch of ground. But after Arthur died, the hired hands drifted away one by one toward Warren Pike's larger spread, drawn by higher wages and steadier meals, and Warren used the widow's weakness the way a man uses any weakness he happens to find convenient, returning again and again with low offers to buy her out before the next hard winter finished what the last one had started. The strangest detail of all, the one that would matter far more than anyone yet understood, was the old creek that had once run the length of the property all year round, and now barely trickled at all, reduced to a damp stain along a bed of dry stones. Warren insisted the land had gone worthless, said it plainly and often, and yet he kept coming back to buy worthless land, a contradiction that settled into Rebecca's mind that very first morning, and refused, from then on, to leave her alone. Rebecca did not ask Eleanor for more food that first morning, though her stomach ached with the asking. She asked instead to work in exchange for a place to sleep, and when Eleanor offered her the small, warm room near the kitchen, Rebecca chose the cold space near the barn instead, so she could hear the wind and any animal that might still wander close in the night. It surprised Eleanor more than she let on, though she said nothing about it at the time. That same day, Rebecca began fixing small things without being asked, rehanging the barn door on a fresh length of leather strap, gathering damp straw off the wet ground before it could rot where it lay, sorting old rope by strength and use into neat coils, patching a torn oat sack with a bit of canvas, checking the well for taste and clarity, studying the color of the soil around the broken trough, as though the dirt itself might tell her something useful if she looked at it long enough. When Eleanor finally asked, later that evening over a thin supper where a young widow had learned such things, Rebecca answered simply that her husband had once driven cattle for a living, but long before she ever married him, she had grown up near a cattle trail station in Kansas, in a household where the women learned to keep a herd alive through storms just as thoroughly as the men did, because storms did not care whose hands were doing the work. It was not spoken as a boast. It was stated plainly, the way a person states the weather or the hour, and Eleanor began to understand, slowly and without quite admitting it to herself just yet, that the ranch was not entirely dead after all. It was only sleeping, and the woman standing in her kitchen might well know how to wake it. Word of Eleanor's decision spread through town within a single day, carried faster than any letter could have traveled, and Dean Mercer was the first to turn it into a joke worth repeating at every counter in the valley. He said, Hollow Creek now held the two most useless things a valley could carry into winter: a woman with no hired hands left to call her own, and a widow with no property to her name whatsoever. Warren Pike rode out to the ranch not long after, wearing the false courtesy of a man who has already decided exactly how a conversation will end before it begins, a purchase contract folded neatly and waiting in his coat pocket like a loaded pistol. He told Eleanor she ought to sell before the cold made the choice for her instead, and when he spotted Rebecca mending the barn door with quiet, steady hands, he asked Eleanor with a thin and knowing smile whether she planned to bring the whole ranch back to life on a widow's tears alone. Eleanor said nothing in reply. Rebecca said nothing either, though the mockery settled into her chest and hardened there into something closer to resolve than to shame, something she would carry with her through every cold morning that followed. Cole Brantley refused to sell her mineral salt or hoof ointment on credit. When she tried again a few days later, telling her plainly that a ranch with no herd had no earthly use for either one, Dean Mercer went further still, telling Rebecca outright that if she truly wanted work badly enough, his own outfit needed a laundress, not a woman playing at being a ranch hand in front of the whole valley. None of it arrived as violence, and none of it needed to. It arrived instead as looks exchanged behind her back, as laughter muffled behind raised hands, as small refusals stacked one on top of another until they formed a wall. The particular cruelty of a town that has already decided two women are destined to fail before the first snow even falls. Not everyone in town joined the laughter, though. Naomi Vale, who ran the local eating house at the edge of the square, slipped Rebecca a few pieces of dried bread one gray afternoon and said quietly, almost as an afterthought, that Warren Pike never wasted his time chasing something that was truly worthless. It was a small comment, almost nothing at all on its own, and yet it planted a question in Rebecca's mind that would not leave her alone for the rest of that week. If the ranch held no value whatsoever, why did the richest man in the valley keep circling it like a buyer, afraid someone else might beat him to the purchase? What exactly did Warren Pike know about Hollow Creek that Eleanor herself, its rightful owner for 20 years, still did not? Rebecca began walking the land after that, the way a tracker reads sign across open country, no longer seeing an empty pen but studying instead the cracked mud around the broken water trough, no longer seeing dead grass but noticing which patches at the base of the hill still held a stubborn shade of green, even this late in the season, no longer seeing a dry creek but tracing the faint dark line of moss still clinging to the stones along its old bed. What she found changed everything that came after. The old creek had not gone dry entirely on its own accord. Somewhere upstream, a section of the feeder channel had been choked shut by years of fallen branches, settled silt, and loose stone. Water still moved beneath the ground, seeping quietly through the earth. But it no longer reached the ranch at all, and a channel cleared properly, patiently, over time, could bring that water home again, a resource worth more than gold to any rancher facing a long, cruel season. Inside the old equipment shed, she found forgotten tools that told their own quiet story. Coiled wire gone stiff with age, hoof-trimming instruments rusted at the edges, a few sacks of winter grass seed still sealed tight, a barrel of salt hardened into a solid, useless block, an old saddle worn thin but still repairable with patience, and, tucked beneath it all, like a buried thing waiting to be found, a ledger book that had belonged to Arthur Brooke, filled with careful, handwritten notes about rotating pasture through the changing seasons. In its pages, Arthur had written, in a steady and confident hand, that Hollow Creek never needed a vast herd to survive the winters here. It needed a small herd instead, kept strong and warm through the cold months, allowed to grow slowly and honestly afterward, and he had once planned to raise dairy cows, sturdy draft horses, and a modest flock of sheep, never competing with a man like Warren Pike in raw numbers, surviving instead through steadiness, patience, and careful attention that larger outfits rarely bothered with. Rebecca understood the strategy at once, as clearly as if Arthur himself had spoken it aloud to her across the years. The goal was never to rebuild some grand cattle empire from nothing. The goal was to make Hollow Creek a place with enough water, enough hay, enough warm shelter, and enough small, honest production to carry itself through until spring arrived again. She asked Eleanor for permission to do 3 specific things: to clear the old feeder channel stone by stone, to convert the southern pen into a shelter that could hold real heat through the coldest nights of the year, and to trade what little remained in the shed for a handful of weak, unwanted cattle that other ranchers had no patience left to nurse through the coming season. Eleanor hesitated at first, frightened of failure stacked on top of failure she had already suffered, until Rebecca told her, quietly and without flinching, that a ranch does not come back to life through the largest herd a person can gather in one season. It comes back to life the very moment the first animal survives the snow that everyone said would kill it. Rebecca and Eleanor worked afterward mostly in silence, without any miracle to lean on and without any real money to spend on anything at all. Only 2 women, one aging cart with a wobbling wheel, a handful of tools, and a winter closing in fast behind them, like a door slowly swinging shut. Rebecca cleared the old channel patiently over many cold mornings, refusing to dig it straight and hard for fear of tearing the fragile soil apart entirely, choosing instead to build small steps out of willow branches and river stones to slow the water and guide it gently back toward the waiting trough. After many days of steady, unglamorous labor, water began seeping into the old basin again, thin but steady, a trickle that felt, to both women standing there watching it, like a pulse returning to a body long thought lifeless and beyond saving. Eleanor turned her attention meanwhile to the feed shed, mending torn grain sacks, tying off loose rope ends, laying fresh straw out to dry in the weak autumn sun, and blocking the small gaps that let rodents slip inside at night, movements her hands remembered from years spent working beside her husband long ago, each small motion making her feel, if only briefly and only for a moment, young again in a way she had not expected to feel ever more. Rebecca traded the newly repaired saddle for 2 thin, shivering cattle that Dean Mercer had planned to send off to slaughter for almost nothing at all, and the whole town laughed about it openly, certain she was bringing sickness straight back into Hollow Creek with her own 2 hands. But Rebecca checked their eyes, their hooves, and the rhythm of their breathing carefully, one animal at a time, and she knew the truth long before anyone else in town would believe it. They were not diseased in the slightest. They were only cold, hungry, and neglected in exactly the wrong way by people too impatient to notice the difference. She mixed a mineral salt paste from what little remained in that hardened barrel, warmed water over the kitchen fire for the animals to drink, layered fresh straw thick across the pen floor, and rubbed their cracked hooves with old fat and ash to keep them from splitting further in the cold. Slowly, over the course of 2 difficult weeks, the 2 cattle began to stand steadier on their feet, their eyes brighter, their coats less dull. An aging horse that Warren Pike had once discarded outright for weak legs joined the ranch as well around that same time, taken in by Rebecca to pull a light cart whenever one was needed for the smaller chores. Naomi Vale began buying the small amount of milk the ranch now produced to make soup for her eating house, and that modest, unglamorous sum became the very first money Hollow Creek had earned honestly in longer than anyone in town could recall, without pausing to think hard about it first. Warren Pike grew uneasy the moment word reached him that water had returned to Hollow Creek in any real quantity, because he had quietly planned all along to control that winter water source for the benefit of his own enormous herd once the widow finally gave up and sold. He pressed the 2 women through several channels at once, methodically, like a man closing off every exit from a room 1 door at a time. First, he convinced Cole Brantley to refuse Eleanor any further credit for supplies of any kind. Then he let his own men spread word through town that Rebecca had brought sick cattle into the valley. On purpose, a rumor Dean Mercer eagerly repeated at every opportunity, warning anyone who would listen that if disease truly spread outward from Hollow Creek, the whole region would suffer the consequences together. Sheriff Travis Boone was eventually forced to ride out and inspect the ranch for himself, duty-bound whether he believed the rumor or not. Rebecca stayed calm throughout the visit and showed him everything without a moment's hesitation. The cattle standing steady in their pen, the warm shelter, clean water moving in the trough, dry hay stacked properly, and a written record of every single animal's condition kept in careful, dated order. The sheriff found no sickness anywhere on the property, not a trace of it, though he warned Eleanor plainly on his way out that if another complaint reached his desk, he would have no choice but to return and look again, whether he wanted to or not. Warren pressed harder still after that failed attempt, this time through an old debt Eleanor owed at Cole Brantley's store from years back, making it clear through a quiet word to Cole that if she failed to settle it before the first heavy snow fell, Cole would be entirely within his rights to seize part of her remaining tools and stores as payment. It was pressure sharp enough to shake even Eleanor's steady resolve, and she began to fear, quietly and privately, that she was dragging Rebecca down into her own slow collapse. That night, sitting by a low fire with the wind picking up outside, Eleanor told Rebecca she should leave, before it was too late for both of them to recover from what was coming. Rebecca answered simply that Eleanor had given her a roof when she had absolutely nothing left in the world to her name, and she would not walk away now, not when the ranch had only just begun to breathe again after so long lying still. She proposed a plan instead that was bold and difficult in equal measure. Using the newly warmed southern pen to take in weak cattle temporarily from other ranchers who had no patience left to nurse animals through an early cold snap in exchange for a modest fee, or for a share of the herd itself if the animals survived under her care. Eleanor worried aloud that it would only invite more ridicule from a town already laughing at them freely. But Rebecca told her plainly, without a trace of doubt in her voice, that the town had already laughed as much as it ever intended to. Now, she said, they could make that very laughter pay them back with interest. Word that Rebecca would take in weak cattle spread quickly through the valley within days, and at first, most people treated it as simply another joke to share over supper. Dean Mercer brought over one especially gaunt cow himself, saying openly that if Rebecca somehow managed to save it, he would call her the Lord's own cattle doctor from that day forward. Warren Pike sent 2 weakened yearlings as well, though not out of any real faith in her ability, but in the quiet hope they would die on Hollow Creek soil so the blame for it could fall squarely and permanently on her instead of on him. Rebecca accepted every single animal handed to her without complaint, but she required a written record for each one in return, noting the exact date and hour of arrival, the owner's name, and every visible sign of sickness or weakness present at the time it crossed onto her land. Naomi Vale helped her review the careful wording of each entry so no one could twist it later to their own advantage, and Sheriff Travis Boone personally signed as a witness on several of the more disputed cases. No children appeared anywhere in this part of the story, and none were needed. Every hand that came to help was a grown adult, already worn down by hardship somewhere in town. Mason Reed, a blacksmith who had lost both his shop and his steady work months earlier. Clara Monroe, a widowed seamstress, trying quietly to piece together a living stitch by stitch, and Tyler Brooks, a former ranch hand, nursing an old injury in his shoulder that no employer wanted to work around anymore. They came asking only for a decent meal and a place to sleep in the old shed in exchange for honest labor, nothing more. Eleanor worried at first there would not be enough food to stretch around a growing table, but Rebecca organized everyone into careful shifts, mending fences at dawn, gathering firewood before noon, warming feed through the afternoon, drying straw whenever the sun allowed it, tending hooves each evening before supper, until the work found its own steady rhythm that carried the whole ranch forward together. From this point on, the idea of family running quietly through the whole of this story stopped meaning blood relation entirely and became something else instead, something sturdier, a group of grown people the town had cast aside one by one, now working together to bring a dying ranch back fully to life. Rebecca turned the southern pen into a true heat-holding system built from patience rather than money, thick, dry straw layered deep, wind-blocking doors hung true, warm stones set carefully near the trough. Each evening, a feeding schedule kept light but perfectly consistent, and water kept moving so it would never freeze solid overnight. She could not save every single animal through will and care alone, and one did not survive despite everything she tried, a loss that made the whole story feel truer and harder, rather than softer or easier to bear. But most of the weakened cattle recovered fully under her hands, and by the end of that long stretch, Hollow Creek was no longer a silent place at all. There was the steady sound of hammers at work, the deep breath of horses settling for the night, water moving quietly through the trough, and Eleanor's own voice calling everyone in from the cold to eat together. The first hard freeze of the season swept down into the valley earlier than anyone in town had predicted or prepared for. Temperatures dropped sharply overnight. Water froze solid on many of the larger ranches across the whole region, and Warren Pike's massive herd began to suffer badly because he had kept far too many animals crowded onto low pasture land, where the wind cut straight through unbroken, and the water troughs sat too far from any real shelter to matter. At Hollow Creek, Rebecca had already prepared carefully for exactly this moment. The old channel still moved slowly beneath a careful layer of straw and boards laid across its surface to keep it from freezing solid overnight. The low shelter held its warmth through even the coldest hours. Weak cattle drank warm water mixed lightly with mineral salt and ate heated feed twice a day, while the adult workers took turns checking the herd through the darkest part of every single night without complaint. Then came a deliberate act of sabotage that no one had fully expected, even after everything Warren had already tried. Someone working quietly for Warren Pike cut open a section of fence along the northern boundary under cover of darkness, and several of the recovering cattle wandered loose into the freezing night before anyone noticed. Rebecca noticed human footprints pressed into the frost among the scattered animal tracks the next morning, not merely animal sign left behind by panic, and Tyler Brooks followed the trail patiently until he found the herd safe just before the cold could finish what the sabotage had clearly started. Sheriff Travis Boone was called out once again, and this time he found clear, deliberate cut marks on the wire itself, evidence enough that he began, for the first time, to seriously suspect Warren Pike's hands were not entirely clean in this whole affair after all. Around that same time, Naomi Vale overheard a customer in her crowded eating house, repeating something Warren himself had bragged about openly over drinks, that Hollow Creek would lose every last head of cattle before Christmas arrived that year. She repeated the comment to the sheriff without a moment's hesitation, understanding exactly what it meant the instant she heard it. Warren was not formally accused of anything just yet, the evidence still too thin to hang a man on, but the polished reputation he had carefully built for himself across the valley began to show its very first real cracks in front of the whole town watching. More importantly still, buried deep in Arthur Brooks' old ledger, Rebecca found a note describing a hidden winter meadow tucked away behind the ridge, a place naturally sheltered from the worst of the wind, where dry grass still lay waiting beneath only a thin layer of snow, even in the harshest months of the year. Warren wanted Hollow Creek precisely because of that hidden meadow and the underground water running beneath it, not because the land was worthless, as he had claimed loudly to anyone in town willing to listen to him. Eleanor finally understood, sitting alone with the ledger open in her lap late one night, that her husband had never once left her a dead ranch at all, not for a single day. She had only been isolated slowly, pushed gently and deliberately to believe the land beneath her own feet had already died long ago, when in truth it had simply been waiting patiently for the right pair of hands to remember what it could still give back to anyone willing to work for it, honestly. True winter arrived in full at the end of December, settling over the valley like a lid closing on a pot. Snow lay thick and unbroken across every field for miles, and the wind made the wooden doors of every barn creak and groan through the long, dark nights that stretched on longer than anyone wanted them to. On the larger outfits scattered across the valley, feed disappeared far faster than anyone had planned for, because their herds were simply too large to manage carefully in such conditions, and weakened animals across the whole region began falling sick one after another in a slow, grim procession. Warren Pike, the very man who had once mocked Eleanor so freely and so publicly, now faced a crisis of his own careless making. His enormous herd sat trapped on low pasture land, his water troughs frozen solid through, and his feed stores ruined by a leaking roof he had never once bothered to repair properly. He had numbers on his side, more cattle than anyone else in the valley by far, but he lacked the discipline of careful daily attention, and a large ranch, it turned out that winter, was never quite the same thing as a healthy one. Hollow Creek, meanwhile, was not wealthy in any showy or obvious sense, but it was alive in every sense that actually mattered when the temperature dropped and stayed dropped. The shelter stayed warm through the worst nights. The water kept moving steadily through the trough. The cattle continued healing under careful hands. Milk and butter arrived regularly enough now to sell to Naomi Vale's eating house each week, and mended leather goods and repaired saddles traded steadily for nails, salt, and ointment whenever they were needed. Mason Reed repaired the front gate patiently until it hung true again on its hinges for the first time in years. Clara Monroe sewed warming wraps by lamplight for the weakest of the recovering yearlings, still finding their strength. Tyler Brooks built windbreaks around every exposed trough on the property, one board at a time, without a single word of complaint, through the whole long process. On Christmas night, the town saw something none of them had expected to see when they rode past the edge of the valley. Hollow Creek stood lit from within, smoke rising steadily and evenly from its chimney into the cold night sky, the low, contented sound of cattle drifting out from the barn, and grown adults gathered together warmly around a full table set inside the house. Eleanor no longer ate her supper alone in that quiet kitchen. Rebecca no longer stood outside a stranger's door in the rain, begging for shelter from anyone who would listen. The people the town had once discarded so easily were slowly becoming something that looked, unmistakably and undeniably now, like a real family gathered under one roof. Dean Mercer arrived at the gate not long after, asking Rebecca directly to come look at his own struggling herd before it was too late for him too. He tried at first to keep his old pride fully intact, standing stiffly at the fence, but eventually admitted plainly, almost against his own will, that He had no idea anymore why his cattle could no longer stand on their own two legs. Rebecca did not shame him for asking. She simply picked up her coat, walked out with him through the snow, and saved a good portion of his herd, using methods he had once dismissed openly as nothing more than a foolish woman's tricks. Warren Pike eventually came as well, though not to apologize, and certainly not right away or easily. He came instead to offer once more to buy Hollow Creek outright, this time at a far higher price than he had ever offered before, standing at the very gate he had once threatened to buy out from under them both. Eleanor refused him without a single moment's hesitation, her voice steadier than it had been in years. This ranch, she told him plainly, looking him straight in the eye, was no longer empty, and it was never for sale again. The story did not need a loud ending to feel complete, and it did not get one. In the months that followed winter's worst and hardest weeks, Hollow Creek became a place spoken of across the whole valley with genuine respect. Not because it had grown into the largest outfit around by any measure, but because it had survived that brutal season better than almost anyone else had managed to. Sheriff Travis Boone eventually confirmed, after careful investigation, what many in town had already quietly begun to suspect on their own, that Warren Pike had used old debts, false rumors of disease, and a deliberately cut fence line to force Eleanor towards selling her land against her will. Warren was never painted as some cartoonish villain in the eyes of the town, nothing so simple as that, yet his standing in the valley suffered lasting and very real damage from what came out. And one rancher after another quietly stepped away from his influence to begin trading directly with Hollow Creek instead of him. Cole Brantley, the very man who had once turned Rebecca away flatly at his own counter, rode out himself that spring to offer Eleanor a proper trading account with fair terms. She accepted his offer, but only on the firm condition that every transaction from that point forward be written down clearly and honestly, with no more vague debts left hanging over the poor to be used as leverage later. Rebecca herself was no longer a woman asking anyone for shelter or charity of any kind. She had become Hollow Creek's co-manager alongside Eleanor in every practical sense, and Mason, Clara, Tyler, and the other grown hands who had joined them through that hard winter stayed on into the spring as well. No one in town called them charity cases any longer, not even quietly behind closed doors. They were simply the ranch's crew now, and everyone in the valley understood it, without ever needing to be told directly. When spring finally arrived in full, the creek at Hollow Creek ran clearer and stronger than it had in years, its channel kept clean and steady through careful, ongoing attention. The hidden winter meadow behind the ridge greened early, well before the fields on any neighboring ranch, and the very cattle once dismissed as worthless by half the valley now stood strong and healthy beneath the returning sun, coats shining, legs steady. Naomi Vale continued buying milk, butter, and salted meat from Hollow Creek for her eating house each week, a small but steady arrangement that had grown, almost without anyone noticing, out of nothing more than a few coins for soup one desperate winter before. By early summer, Hollow Creek had settled into a rhythm that no one in town would have predicted the previous autumn. The pasture behind the ridge held enough grass to carry a modest herd through the following winter without strain, and Rebecca had already begun sketching plans in Arthur Brooke's old ledger for a small dairy operation that could supply not only Naomi Vale's eating house but 2 neighboring towns as well. Eleanor watched her work some evenings without saying much, simply content to see the pages filling again with a steady, purposeful hand, the way they once had when her husband was still alive to fill them himself. Mason Reed had taken to shoeing horses for half the valley out of the repaired forge behind the barn. Clara Monroe's mended harnesses and stitched grain sacks were requested by name at the store now, and Tyler Brooks, his shoulder stronger after a season of honest work, had begun training the recovering yearlings to pull a cart as gently as the old horse once had. In the final scene, Eleanor stood quietly on the porch at dusk, watching Rebecca close the gate to the barn as the last light faded slowly behind the ridge. She heard the low, contented sound of cattle settling in for the night, the easy, warm laughter of grown adults drifting out from the kitchen behind her, and water moving steadily somewhere out past the house in the growing dark. The ranch had not simply found its money again after everything it had lost. It had found the sound of a life still being lived fully within it, day after day, season after season. The night Rebecca first begged to be allowed to stay, standing soaked and shivering at a stranger's door with nothing left to her name. Eleanor believed she was only sharing the last of her bread with one more desperate stranger, passing through a hard season. She had no way of knowing then that the woman standing at her door that night, half frozen and utterly alone, would end up carrying the whole of Hollow Creek back from the edge of death itself, one small stubborn act of care at a time, until the ranch was breathing again on its own.